There we go. Okay. I'd like to welcome everybody to our first afternoon session with Jonathan Hulbert, or John, which I'm used to. I know he's Jonathan. And as founder of Roadmap for Change, John equips leaders, teams, and organizations with practical skills and strategies necessary to navigate complex change, whether it involves technology-driven transformation, organizational restructuring, or cross-functional initiatives. In addition to his consulting work, John teaches graduate courses on leadership and assessment at SUNY Buffalo State University. Before launching Roadmap for Change, John helped lead major organizational change initiatives across higher education, including serving as the organizational change management specialist for the University of Southern California and the University at Buffalo. In these roles, he worked directly with senior leadership teams to strengthen culture, develop leaders, and move complex institutional priorities forward. His work in advancing leadership and workforce development has earned national recognition, including the Workforce Magazine Game Changer Award, which honors 40 professionals under 40, shaping the future of the field. Prior to working in the SUNY system, John served as Dean of Student Success at Tiffin University, where he was responsible for managing the institution's retention strategy and academic student support services. This afternoon, his topic is facilitating collaborative change management through creative problem solving. John, you're on.
Hey, thank you so much, Joe.
Mhm.
And good afternoon, everybody. Just as we're getting started here, I'd love if folks would just maybe enter in the chat, maybe where you're coming from work-wise and in your role, just so we have a sense of who's in the room today. So that's always interesting to do. But we'll go ahead and get started. So what I'm going to be focusing on today is a couple of things, really looking at change management through the lens of collaborative, creative problem solving. And so, how can we take some of those tools, some of those strategies related to creative problem solving and apply that to change management in a way that really meaningfully involves individuals in that change process? So, a couple of things that we'll walk through in terms of our agenda and outcomes. We'll describe why change is complex for people and is not necessarily a linear process, but it's rather nonlinear. We'll talk about some strategies for facilitating collaborative change using what I call the 3 Ps of change management. And then we'll walk through some specific ways, and I'm actually going to give you kind of insight into how to actually facilitate and apply CPS to specific change management methodologies in a way that engages stakeholders. And then lastly, we'll have a discussion about what are some ways that we can involve impacted stakeholders in actually leading change initiatives to make sure that those change initiatives succeed and there's also buy-in and ownership over them over time. So one of the first things I think is important is actually to define what change management is. And I think that sometimes there's a misconception. So I like to think that change management was in a sense invented because a lot of organizational projects that were, had a very clear endpoint and goal, but maybe a lot of challenges in starting, weren't necessarily focusing on the people side of change. And so there's usually in most organizations a wonderful department that's typically titled organizational development and training or organizational effectiveness. And in those departments, there are people that have a really good understanding of organizational behavior, organizational psychology, training and development. And many times, individuals in those departments were being selected to work on certain projects of this sort. And so they sort of took that notion and sort of created formal roles, sometimes on projects or informal, of change management specialists. But in a sense, what change management is it is project-based organizational development. And so typically it involves managing a project from the current state that it's at right now. And so, for example, let's say that we were merging together two different departments in an organization. So they're separating they're separate in terms of their function, they're separate in terms of their processes, and now we want to combine processes and functions to maybe streamline operations, which is that future state. So it's that process of really shifting individual teams in the organization from that current state to that future state. And typically there's a clear end and start to how change management is offered. So want to kind of orient us to that lens as we begin. So in terms of change initiatives in organizations, and I just wanted to kind of hear from the group here very quickly. What are some common reasons that you see change initiatives fail in organizations? You can either put this in the chat or you're welcome to unmute and share your wonderful voice.
Hearing
Okay.
unclear expectations, unclear goals,
Great. Thank you,
lack of
Joe.
buy-in, no
Yeah.
shared vision.
Shared vision. Excellent. Yeah, right. So it's really important to have that target, right, that people are working towards, some coherence in that vision and direction and goals. We actually heard about that a little bit from the keynote this morning, talking about, right, coherence of values, behaviors, and goals individually, but that's also true, right, in a change setting as well. Um, see, no training or enablement, so actually supporting that change. So although we might decide that we have a direction for the change, if there isn't support or communication, right, that change can fall apart. So lots of reasons that change tends to fail. And so when we think about change management, what we're really balancing when there isn't a clear vision sometimes, or maybe there is an agreement on that vision or direction, as well as unclear enablement, is a lot of times we're seeing that tension between change and stability in organizations. And so there's a great framework originated with Barry Johnson called polarity management. And I just like to kind of orient folks to think about change sort of in this way. And so anytime that you're working on a change initiative, you're moving from something that is stable to something that is changing. But that flow of what is stable in our organizations and what is changing never ends, right? We're always continuously improving things, we're always adapting things. And think of this much like breathing, right? Which is the example. So, right, in order to live, we have to be able to inhale. And then we also have to be able to exhale. And if we do one for too long, inhale or exhaling, we most likely will pass out and not feel so great. And so, much like inhaling and exhaling, change inside of organizations is constant, and we're always fluctuating between stability and change. And we have both that are required. And so, what makes that challenging for folks is the actual impact that change has on us as individuals, but also as groups. And so my favorite way to kind of conceptualize why change is difficult, why we have what we call sometimes resistance, is really looking at the kind of biological mechanisms behind why human beings tend to resist or have anxiety during times of change. So what I like to think about is in any workplace or any work environment, in general, right, an ideal employee or an employee that let's say is content and will stay has a pretty high sense of what I'll call well-being and contentment. I never say happiness because work is work, and I don't necessarily know if we're always happy. So I like to say contentment, right? We're going for that baseline. And so what that typically looks like in organizations is people that have contentment and well-being, they feel a sense of control and competence to influence their life's outcomes, right? So they have a sense of agency, right? What I do in the organization, the actions that I take will move me closer to my goals. Individuals also feel empowered to make progress towards those goals that are set for them, right? Remove barriers, overcome challenges. And then my favorite one is a sense of humility. So respect for oneself and others, but also understanding the complexity of life, right? I don't know everything, but I know quite a bit and I can contribute, but I also have a lot to learn from my colleagues. So in general, right, that's how we're going through our day at work when we're feeling that. And then comes change, right? And so the literal definition of anxiety is fear of the unknown, right? Or the unexpected. And so once we experience change, right, it disrupts some of those feelings of agency or control over our work. It might disrupt our feelings of empowerment, right? That we can make progress towards clear goals because that process that we're used to is changing. And it might make us question if our colleagues can actually help us make this change successful because, Jim, who I work with over in the corner, tends to not do so well whenever we change something, right? So it begins to kind of disrupt those different thoughts. And no matter how quickly one adapts or likes change, right? We even go through that process. It might take a minute, could take hours, it could take days, it could take years. It varies for each person. And so, as a result of that uncertainty, most people tend to have an emotional reaction to change that can look like resistance and anxiety. If you look at the change literature, even the most recent meta-analysis, there's no agreement overall of where resistance comes from because people are very complicated. But a couple of the reasons that people tend to react to change in a way that looks like resistance. One is individuals feel like, again, they're losing that sense of control. The other is a fear that I might not be competent in the new way of working or doing things that is required, right? I'm afraid that I'm going to look stupid, for lack of a better term, to my coworkers, or I'm going to fail. The other is tolerance for ambiguity and risk. So most of you, I'm sure, have facilitated before. I've seen your names. And so, right, you even know when doing facilitation and embarking on exploring a topic, right? There's folks in the room that sometimes have a lower tolerance for that ambiguity, right? When you're starting to clarify a challenge or you're starting to ideate solutions. And so some people are opposed to that. Capacity. Sometimes individuals and organizations have too much on their plate, so there is no time or room to take on that new work to change. History. They have been exposed to multiple changes that are flavors of the week by their supervisors. And each time that change has not worked well for the department, maybe it's caused more work. And so people might perceive that change in a negative way or a positive way if in the past change has worked well. Group dynamics for most change initiatives, when you start to dig in at a lower level of why something maybe isn't working, it could be that the employees aren't doing it because they dislike their supervisor, or it could be the employees aren't doing it because there's one employee that's carrying the load of work for the rest, right? And so there's a lot of reasons. And then lastly, which is my favorite one to talk to executives about, is the quality of the change. Maybe the idea for change is actually a really bad one. And maybe we're not clear enough, right, on what we're changing and why. And so there's resistance because of that. And so how that resistance tends to manifest is a response of fight, flight, freeze, or adapt. And so you'll have people that might be actively resisting a change that's occurring. And so this might look like arguing, pushing back. You have individuals in flight, which is they might ignore right, trainings or opportunities for engagement. They might kind of walk away from opportunities to be a part of the design of the change. Freeze, which is my favorite response, which is I'm going to do nothing because every change has failed here in the organization in the past. And so I'm just going to wait it out and nothing will happen. And then adapt, right, which is the scenario that we would like to get to. And I think allows us to kind of retain our sense of control and agency in our life, which is adapting to that change, learning what you need to learn, right, being a part of it, being a part of the design and buying in. And so how can we, with this mess of humanness that we tend to experience during change initiatives, actually create a process that allows people to regain a sense of agency, empowerment, and humility during that process? And there's really three principles that I like to look at. And then you'll see these integrated throughout the actual application to creative problem solving through that lens. The first is making change visible. And so as someone that might be in charge of a change initiative, it's really important to have clear indicators that show people where you are in the change process, what's already been built and developed. And this isn't just words on a page, but actual visuals that people can connect to and see how that change is progressing and where they fit, right? That creates some sense of certainty in the uncertainty that we're experiencing. The other is facilitating a collaborative process. And so whether you call it creative problem solving or human-centered design, or total quality management, whatever those pieces are, creating a process where people can be involved in designing what that change looks like, whether it's for their department, their process, their area. And that starts to build a sense of control, but also trust, right? I'm now building something with my coworkers or with these other people impacted by the change. And then the last one, which is really important, is those that are closest to the work. It's important that they actually are the ones eventually leading the implementation of the change, right? And they're empowered to do that. That's going to ensure both competence and quality of the outcomes. An old saying is the higher you are in an organization, the less you hear, and the lower you are in the organization, the more quiet you become. And I think it's important to recognize that because sometimes leaders tend to not hear what's most important for implementing a change, and the people actually doing the work have that information. So, how do you actually practically do all of these three things? So, in terms of change management, I like to think of it sort of there's three areas that someone that managing change is constantly managing for a project-based change. And I'm going to tell you both these three different tools that are typically used by change managers to do this, but really anybody can use this in any role that's leading a change initiative. The first area, which is making sure that we're establishing a sense of purpose and documenting that and bringing that with us to present to others. And so, what that looks like is establishing the why that change is actually occurring. So, what are the current state reasons that the change is needed, and what outcomes can that lead to? Also, for individuals at different levels in the organization, also answering that question of what is in it for them. So, how might this change, right, make things easier for them, but also how will it impact them? And what are all of those processes, roles, and behaviors that we might need to change? And what does that actually look like, right? So, you're painting this picture of where we are today and where we can be in the future. The second area that's important is this focus on people, of course, right? Change management is the idea of managing change by managing the people side of the operation. And what you're looking at for people, and typically how that's documented is in a stakeholder impact analysis, is who is impacted, what is their level of influence, and what is the level of impact on them? What do they need to change? And then what I like to call what are competing commitments or things that might cause them to resist that are embedded in the organization. And so an example of that might be, I've now been asked to use this new online purchasing system for the entire organization. But it takes me so long to go through all the approvals in this purchasing system that it's actually easier for me just to email the office, and there's someone in the office, right, that's still actually taking those requests. And so there's a competing commitment that it's actually easier, right, to do this in a different way. And then it also looks at the formal power and informal networks in an organization to make sure that we're engaging the right people at the right time in the right order for that change initiative. So that's called a stakeholder impact analysis. And then the last area is the process. And this is actually how the change occurs, right? What are those steps that we're going to take to get from where we are today to implementing that future state, whether it's a enterprise research system or it's a merger of two schools, whatever that might be, what are those actual physical steps that we'll take? So what we're going to dig into now is I'll actually show you how I apply creative problem solving to actually building out current and future state, stakeholder impact analysis, and then lastly, stakeholder engagement plan and the communication plan. So in terms of applying those three different models, and I'm not going to go through this whole chart here. This is what I typically use when looking at organizational change at a macro level. And so there's a series of stages that change goes through from developing the business case to the macro change strategy. So this would be working with leadership or those responsible for the change to define the boundaries, goals, success measures, then working with the individuals actually involved in the change. They're doing the work. So this is micro change sense making, and then designing those change interventions with those individuals that are actually doing the work. And all of that information is feeding back into those different tools that I mentioned, which is that technical current and future state, stakeholder impact analysis, and then lastly, that stakeholder engagement and comms plan. So that's your information that you're continuously iterating on, refining, and building on as you're engaging those different levels of the change. So that's where we'll focus today is on the right side. On the left side is then that actual implementation of the change, which we're not going to focus as much on. So how I think of change management is actually like a Sherpa. So if anybody has done any mountain climbing or rock climbing, typically the role of Sherpa is to guide the group and really shepherd them up the mountain, ensuring that supplies is brought with them, resources, there's risks identified along the way so we don't fall down, a snow hole, ensuring that the group also is planning and working together during that process and creating the process so they can plan and work together to get up the mountain. And so all of those different stages that you saw on the previous screen, when you're managing a change initiative, your job is really making sure you're bringing all of that information that you're collecting from every group you're working with and creating coherence and connection between all of it. And so those three tools that I talked about is what allows us to do that. So the first thing that I think is really critical in an organization, especially when applying any collaborative process, especially creative problem solving, to planning and discussing change with a group, is you have to explain the why. All of us that are at this conference, we understand the value of creativity, the value of creative process, but that one individual who's been working in procurement for 25 years and has never engaged in a collaborative process are going to be skeptical and think it's a waste of time. And so it's very important to kind of explain that. So there's two different kind of bodies of research I like to pull from. A lot of it is summarized in this book, The Extended Mind. Highly recommend it. And it talks about the value that we get when we are able to turn abstract thinking into actual spatial thinking or something we can actually see, right? And so my favorite way to describe this is you wouldn't build a building without actually drawing out a plan to build the building, right? You'd want to actually see the schematics, who's doing what, how we're going to coordinate. You want to have some ideas. And the same is with, a more human process or a change that we're having in an organization, right? We need to be able to see what we're doing, make sense of it, and move things around so it works in the right way. The other area is that it's important that we're doing this as a collaborative group because humans are hardwired and very sensitive to context. And so when any kind of change is occurring, you get more power quicker from the collective intelligence of a group when everybody can think about, hey, what is the real goal of this change? How does it impact me? Who else does it impact, right? And what might be the ways that we can get there, right? You're tapping into a larger group to think about that, and you get inevitably more creative solutions to get from where you are currently to that future state with less pain. So both of those reasons are very useful. So how I apply creative problem solving to change management is typically I start off with ensuring that we're clarifying, are we solving the right challenges with this change? And do we have the right goals that we're aiming towards, both at the highest level and also that lower level? The second piece is once we have a sense of shared challenges and goals, there's alignment, there's coherence between the executive level and let's say the operational level in the organization. You then want to think about who are all those individuals that are impacted. And so I'm going to walk you through a process where you can actually use brainstorming in a very quick way to identify lots of stakeholders that are impacted and also brainstorm what are the ways that we can engage those different stakeholders that need to be connected with in the organization to ensure they're supported for the change. Once we have a sense of all of the individuals that are impacted by the change and how they're impacted, you then can develop that into a stakeholder engagement and communication plan. So these are the different steps that we're going to take in the order of steps that we're going to take to actually move from our current to future state. And then lastly, for implementation, you're focusing on implementing that action plan and then making continuous improvements for refinement, right? So it's following through that process. So the first area that's important is you typically are starting a change initiative in an organization with either a responsible team or it might even be at the executive level, right? And so typically what I'll do in that situation is I have set up a normal kind of a brainstorming space. And what we're doing in that first session is really clarifying what is the current set of conditions that is causing the need for this change? What are the challenges and problems we're trying to solve? What's going on today? What are those future state conditions that we want to see? So what are those goals that we're moving towards? And then lastly, what are those success measures? The reason that I think it's very helpful and I've found it extremely useful to do this with a group is when you can have them actually defer judgment and actually write down what they think the goals are. And you can have them defer judgment and write down what they think the real challenges are that you're solving. What I find is that that team had completely different views of what that change is for. And you start to build coherence and understanding of the different perspectives around why that change needs to occur, and also what are the current challenges in place. And you get to hear from different departments, right, that might not normally work together, what those goals and what those challenges might be. So now you start to build a broader view of what that challenge is. Um, I've done this with a group in 30 minutes for a change that involved closing down two sections of their organization. And they were able to quickly identify a number of challenges that they had not been able to name before, that they added to their project plan, about 40 different new challenges they had to think about when closing down that building. So very useful. So as I said before, the old quote that I'll use again, the higher you are in the organization, the less you hear. The lower you are in the organization, the less you speak. It is great once you work with that leadership team, executive team, to think about what are all the challenges that we need to solve, what are the goals, and then you do your roadshow where you then start to ask these questions at the levels of the organization that are actually doing the work and that are going to be impacted. And this is where you find all of the creepy crawlies under the rocks that you never expected. And so that next phase is engaging those different groups. So let's say we were changing a purchasing process inside of a large organization, right? You might go and talk to the procurement team. You might go and talk to the IT team because they're going to have to be responsible for implementing that shift. You might go and talk to the different business officers around the organization to kind of really understand what's going on. And you're going through that same exercise, right? You're telling them this is kind of the overarching vision we have right now for this change and why it's needed, but we want to get more understanding from you in your day to day. Are we working on the right problems for this change? What is working and what is not working, and what are some of those risks and ideas that you have for the change? And the other piece that's very helpful at this stage is also developing process maps. So, for the procurement example, you want to actually engage people in clarifying the current state of things and understanding how does that process actually work today. By building out those process maps, you then start to see interdependence and operational realities, and then you're able to communicate that information now back up to the executive level and then get a clearer sense of these are the real challenges we're trying to solve, right? And these are the real goals that we have based on now both levels of the organization. So creating that coherence is extremely important. The problem, and this is a true story, when you don't do this, is things can happen like the technology that you've implemented doesn't work because nobody thought about the old legacy technology that had data in it with maybe tons of customers that had automated messages or statements going out to them. And now you've got, $1 million lawsuit on your hands because none of those individuals got those messages because you never did this, right? Clarified the real challenges. So extremely important to kind of get both levels of that understanding. And then what this looks like in terms of a template is typically you then build out the type of change, and you'd have different types depending on the change, the information about where you are currently to where you're going, any competing commitments that would cause the change to not be successful. And then lastly, what are those associated processes and systems you documented that are important to keep in mind when going through that change process? Okay. Moving on to the stakeholder analysis. So once you have a clear sense of the challenges that you're looking to address with the change, as well as the goals that you're working towards, the next thing that you typically do from a change management perspective, is you identify who is impacted and how. My favorite question to ask when I do a stakeholder analysis is if you were in their shoes, what are all of the questions that you would ask about this change? And that sort of tells you something, right, about the questions that they would have related to what they need for support, but also can highlight risks and impacts that are unknown. So typically how I do this, very similar to the last exercise, I have groups identify what are all of the possible groups that could be impacted by this change, doing this at a macro and a micro level. And I have them brainstorm all of those different groups. What is the impact? What is not changing for this group? And what kinds of questions and concerns might you have? again, I can tell you in 30 minutes, you could generate for a change 100 different groups and individuals that are impacted in the time that it typically takes a change manager to go on their Sherpa Roadshow and go around to every group and say, what's the impact? Hey, what's the impact, right? That could take weeks. Instead, you can actually get the group that are involved in the change in a room and actually brainstorm and get that information a little bit quicker. Once you have that information, and then usually move that into a development phase, which is looking at both power and impact inside of the organization. So based on these individuals that are impacted, what power do they have to influence the success or the failure of the change? And what is the level of impact that they're experiencing? And because consultants love matrix like this, 2 by 2 matrix, I added a fifth column. That's a joke, which is we don't know, because sometimes you don't know. And so this allows you to, again, really identify those different power dynamics, which then will inform, right, the stakeholder engagement plan, which is what is that order in which you're going to socialize the change and work with people on the change. So individuals that might have more power in the organization, you might want to start with them, getting their buy-in, discussing the change with them before you start to work with individuals that might have a little bit less power in the organization, just to ensure that it sticks over time. And so typically what this looks like, imagine this in a giant Excel document. You would have the groups that are impacted, what that impact is, what's not changing, questions and concerns, power and impact level, competing commitments, and then suggested engagement types. And then that allows you for a large change initiative to actually segment communications, segment engagement by each stakeholder group that's actually impacted by the change. And so I facilitated one change initiative that involved 20,000 employees in hospitals and at a university. And so, this stakeholder analysis legitimately had like 500 different groups and individuals that we had to work with, right? So you can go from very small to very big in terms of complication over time. And then lastly, the process in terms of creating a stakeholder engagement and communication plan is once we know all the individuals that are impacted, we have a sense of power and impact in the organization. We then can use another development tool, which is really thinking about how does change typically occur in the organization that'll inform the cadence in which we engage people and provide support. So what I mean by that is a lot of organizations have a operating procedure that is unknown to everybody. It's not written down, but it's what groups do you talk to in what order to make sure the change sticks, right? And so that could be that super high value employee that maybe isn't in a formal management role, but has a lot of influence, right? You might end up talking to them second after you talk to their boss because that person is going to influence the rest of the team, right? So what is that order of operation that makes sense? The other thing to think about when putting together your plan for engagement is what messages does your plan send to employees? And so, for example, if we decided that we were going to, again, roll out this change in procurement system, we were going to move it all online to one central place in an organization. And the last group that we trained, and we only trained them 1 week before go live for the system, was the customer service section of the organization that's going to be answering the thousands of calls about the change in the procurement system. That might send a message that we don't really care about quality answers and responses, right? And the ability for that group to prepare for that change. So thinking through as you're reordering and ordering your steps, what message does it send? And then finally, very important factor is what are our financial, personnel, and time constraints in the organization that might change our plans, right? So the order in which you engage people for a change initiative and what that plan looks like, it might shift based on those realities, right? That you necessarily can't control during that time. So moving again from stakeholder engagement, stakeholder analysis to that stakeholder engagement and communication plan, going from ideation into development. And then you got to implement the thing. So typically what these plans look like, again, creating that coherence. So I've got my Sherpa pack on. I went to, let's say, the executive level, and they said, yep, this is the order that we should do for engaging folks in the change. And then you go and talk to, the business officers inside of your organization. that are focused on the financial parts, and they say, actually, you forgot, three other groups that are really, really important because they have to set up the financial logic inside of the procurement system, right? So that's an important step that we take and discuss and socialize with others. And so then, right, you grab their information, put it in your Sherpa pack, you go back to the executives, right, and you add that into the plan. So you're constantly updating that plan along the way. And typically, what these plans look like is just really an implementation plan. So that engagement step, target date, the audience you're working with, communication medium, responsible person, and then any materials you need. And then what's really useful is actually then embedding links within inside of that plan to communications and training resources that you're going to use, right? So everything is in one place. So now you're managing the change. You've got these, three sort of structured documents that you've built, creates coherence in the organization, shared goals, shared structure, shared alignment for moving forward. But then you have to actually implement it, and that's the hard part. So this allows you to at least be on the same page as you're approaching implementation. So one kind of last question, and then we'll I have one more slide, and we'll open it up for kind of questions and discussion. What are some ways that you've seen organizations involve impacted stakeholders in creating a change? Like, what are some ways that you've seen people be involved inside of in a change initiative? In chat, or you can
Many
on.
times ignoring them.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. So
I've
sometimes
seen
ignoring
that.
them. Yeah, that's very
Well,
common.
I was always going to say there's a lot of there's always seems to always be time to do it over, but not the time to do it right in the first place.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. No, that's a
They
really
just
good
don't
point.
budget the right time, tools, or frankly, bring in an outside voice.
Yeah, that's a huge part. And I think to your point, right, timing is really critical for getting people involved. And in the long run, you actually will most likely save money if you give adequate time. Um,
And if everybody knows about it in the first place, you don't just do it all and then lay it on them.
exactly. Yeah.
When I was first learning all the creative problems years ago, learning all the creative problem solving work, I tagged along on a big project, manufacturing type company with some friends of mine. And I remember this one guy named Gid going, I'm in the union. I don't need to change. And he has stuck with me my whole career.
Oh yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of that. And I think what's interesting is I've worked in a lot of unionized environments doing change initiatives. And when you actually can kind of break through and work through a collaborative process and get them involved in a fun way, that attitude tends to break down. Not always. Once in a while,
They
they'll,
had him on board by the end, but it was just that.
yeah,
You know,
it can take a bit. And so some ways to kind of design interventions with stakeholders, there's a couple. One is employees are involved in specific design projects based on interest and skills. So if it's a larger change, I've done things like a skills assessment and then identified employees that could be involved on project teams to be a part of it or lead project teams. Design sprints. So actually, having some time set aside and bringing in stakeholders for design sessions, either in person or virtual. Communities of practice. So, for example, using that procurement example, if all of the procurement officers' jobs are going to change and maybe they've never worked together before, but now they're being centralized, creating a community where people can actually share and learn from each other as that change is occurring. Finding those star employees that can actually help you deliver training, design, and delivery. I was in an organization where we had centralized HR and decentralized HR, and decentralized HR didn't trust centralized HR. So whenever we made a change in central HR, we get the decentralized rock stars to actually lead the training with us, and it seemed to lead to better adoption. Host open office hours to answer questions, provide feedback. And then I think honestly, the best thing that you can do is train managers and influential employees to lead everything that I've talked about above, right? I have found that a change management specialist, we're sometimes a voice, we're a voice going into a void, because people are like, well, this guy's great, but he's going to leave after this change, and we're going to still be here with my manager and this other leader. And so if you can get folks that are going to be in the organization, staying with that group involved to lead some of these, it can be really useful. So here are my references, just so you can look at that back at the recording. And then, yeah, I'd love to open it up to any questions and
There
discussion.
was a comment in the chat.
Yeah. Thank you,
Communication
Joe.
between stakeholders is lacking. Stakeholders only talking among themselves in their group, not enough cross communication.
Yeah, definitely, right? So that tends to be one of the biggest issues, especially with working across groups. I think sometimes in those design sessions, you can create opportunities where people actually build trust across different areas or departments because they start talking about the change, they start learning about each other. And if you do them in person, I have found that it helps to also actually build trust because you're like, oh, you're a human. You're not just a square that I look at right day to day and yell at through email. Like, so it can sometimes build some of that the trust along the way.
You've got
Tyler.
another comment. I think something that is a struggle with large scale
Mhm.
changes is the engagement of stakeholders and having the right people in the room to have feedback. Sometimes project teams overload. What are some of the strategies you use to avoid over engagement?
Great question, Tyler. Some of the strategies that I do use for kind of avoiding that, one is trying to make sure that with the project team or leadership team, we're engaging people at the right time and not too soon. So I think that sometimes like people are like, well, we got to talk to procurement and we got to talk to the budget officers. And you're like, whoa, like we haven't even figured out like what we're doing and how it impacts them yet in any way. And so I think sometimes waiting to do that. I also think that trying to sometimes have people identify who is the first person you want to engage, but who is their like second in command almost. And so maybe it's not a manager, but maybe you're sending someone else from the department, right? It's not always the same person to try to do that. And then I will also track in my stakeholder analysis who we're engaging and when to kind of show like, hey, we've talked to this group like 20 times and it hasn't been productive. So I think we need to come to them with something different. So there are a couple of ways that I've done it.
And Scott
Uh,
says, great material. Are the references available? Scott, the entire session is taped, and you will get the link to all of the sessions that are during this conference after the conference, and so the slides will all be there, so you'll see the references.
I think. Oh, thank you, Tyler. I appreciate that. That's always my goal. So, yeah, if you'd like to stay in touch with me, anyone on this call, and you'd like to, I don't know, talk about change over a virtual cup of coffee or in person, I'm in Buffalo. My contact information, my LinkedIn is there. I'd love to continue the conversation. So I know that we're at time, Joe, and
Yes.
I
And I think
appreciate
one of
that.
the most important ones you picked up on my favorite one is to make sure that everyone involved gets to play the radio station, WIIFM.
Yeah.
What's in it for me?
Yep.
Because,
I've never heard that described as a radio station. I love
yeah,
that.
well, it works.
Yeah, I like that a lot. So,
Okay. Anyone have any other questions or comments that you'd like to give John?
I was going to say thank you. This was really terrific.
Was excellent. Having done it, Kristen and I have both done a lot of this stuff, so we're familiar.
But I also think like we must have crossed paths. I'm looking at like, okay, we know a lot of the same people. We must have been in the same room a few times.
I think we have.
Yeah,
Yeah, it definitely has happened.
really enjoyed this. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank
Thanks,
you all for
everybody.
coming and look forward to seeing you again in future sessions.
Good.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Okay.
I'm gonna stop recording, Joe.
Yep, will do.